let's start looking at basically what we would call in biology the science of ecology. And one of the things we have to do first is talk about the difference between abiotic and biotic organisms. I'm sorry, not organisms, because abiotic would not be organisms. Biotic are organisms. So abiotic are non-living, which you knew already. And these are living, or, very important, once living. So there are no more dinosaurs around, but we know what we know about the life of a dinosaur because of what we've learned from things that are living now. So these living or once living things all fall into the same categories. And when we talk about living things need materials and energy. And eventually that energy is going to be found in the form of ATP. We've done a lot of talk this year about how that energy comes from the sun, goes into sugars, and those sugars are used to make ATP that are used to do things in the cell. And the materials would include things like sugars, the parts to make up an ATP, and everything else that an organism needs to be alive. And some of those materials are abiotic factors. Things like water, shelter, minerals. Oops, I lost my pen there for a second. Even atoms would be considered non-living, but they're important parts of living materials. So when we talk about how living materials interact with each other and with the environment, we not only think of the living things, we have to keep in mind the non-living things as well. And when we talk about living things, I'm going to get a new page here. To make it easier for us, we try to organize things in science. And if we're going to organize living things, we're going to start with, as you might expect, an individual. Oops, can't spell very well. An individual. So let's just pick a random organism, and let's call it, since spring is almost here, I think, or at least I did until yesterday's frost, a hummingbird, ruby-throated hummingbird. And that would be an individual, a member of the species. In this case, the species would be the ruby-throated hummingbird. And I hope to be seeing some of them coming to feeders here any day now. They do migrate in the winter, but I think we're getting closer to summer. So that would be one individual, and we could look at what that one individual does. And if you were studying ruby-throated hummingbirds, you might, as a field biologist, go out and look and find one ruby-throated hummingbird, or maybe you'd be more interested in one moose or one deer or one bear. And you're working with that individual organism, and you're working with that individual organism so that you can learn more about its population. So here's one ruby-throated hummingbird that I hope comes to my bird feeder this summer. But that one ruby-throated hummingbird is part of a number of hummingbirds that are in the area. So all the members of that species in the area. And we'll define that area later on, but it's wherever you're working. In my case, it would be not just my backyard. It's I would guess, at least 50 to 60 miles around here. There must be several thousand hummingbirds. But only one is probably coming to my backyard because they are very territorial. That population has to compete with each other for all those abiotic things we mentioned: water, shelter, food. So they compete with each other, and they do it in a similar way. And we'll come back to that at the end. But that population also has to compete with other living organisms. And those other living organisms require the same basic needs as hummingbirds. Hummingbirds need a certain amount of materials to be alive, and all living things are related. All living things need the same basic things to survive. So they're competing with other living organisms, and those are going to be communities. So that hummingbird if we just look in my backyard, is living in a community that contains humans, cats, dogs, trees, grass. And the trees we could break down into individual kinds of trees. The grass, we could even do that. My backyard has a garden, so there are veggies, there are insects, there's other wildlife. So that community is working together in some ways, but it is also competing in other ways. And we'll talk about the way they work together and the way they compete in a few moments as well. So, but those communities are also working with, or working within, non-living materials. So not only do I have trees, grass, veggies, insects, and wildlife, I have soil, I have water, shelter, and something I like to complain about all the time, weather. And around here, part of that is going to be climate, and that'll be important later on. So when we start we start talking about these communities and the non-living things that work together there, or they need to deal with, then we get an ecosystem. So how do all these living things use all these non-living things? How do they interact with one another? That's what we call an ecosystem. So that start out with an individual. That individual is part of a population. That population lives with other living things that we're going to call a community. And those communities work with the non-living parts of the world to give us an ecosystem. And those ecosystems are determined a lot by climates. So if we look at the type of soil, the amount of water, and the long-term weather, which would be the climate, that climate is going to be very important in determining whether the type of shelter available, the amount and quality of water available, the amount and the quality of the soil available. So based on those climates in general, we'll have some groups of ecosystems that are called biomes. And we'll talk about the specific biomes later on in this this part of the year that we're going through. But it's all based on what we've learned about the cell, the needs of the cell, how the cell survives, how some cells are able to make glucose, all cells are able to use that glucose to make ATP, and in order to do that, they need these things. What is life? So we've got individuals, populations, communities, and ecosystems, and we're going to divide those ecosystems into 8 or 9 different major groups that we're going to call biomes, and all of those 8 or 9 major groups are going to be part of the planet, which gives us the biosphere. So that biosphere is the biggest thing we could look at as a group. The smallest thing we can look at as a group or as a full organism is an individual. And they are organized at these different levels of individuals, populations, communities, ecosystems, biomes, and the biosphere. What I want to do now is look at an important part of something we find in an individual ecosystem, and mostly about a population. So when we look at a population, in an ecosystem, we're looking at one group of organisms, but we're taking into account that that group of organisms lives in a community with other organisms and that they share a similar abiotic environment that we're going to call an ecosystem. So within that ecosystem, they are going to have habitats. So if we go back to my hummingbird friend, that habitat for a hummingbird is an eastern woodland forest. So individual hummingbirds like to live in woodland forests. They like a lot of wood, they like water, and they are found, in this case, they are found in the eastern part of the Americas. So we don't find them in the west. We don't find ruby-throated hummingbirds on the west coast. And actually, I don't think we find hummingbirds in any other continent than North America. But the ruby-throated hummingbird is found in eastern woodland forests of North America. So that's the habitat. That's where they live. My backyard, your backyard, this entire community that we have, what we call Holton, is part of that ecosystem. We've altered it because of buildings and roads and other things, but it's still collectively part of an eastern woodland forest. The habitat is where that hummingbird lives. The other part of that, whoops, I just lost my hand. Other part of that is a niche. And the niche is the job that organism does for and to and with the community that it lives in. So, for example, hummingbirds are important pollinators. They take pollen from one flower and give it to another flower in the process of them getting food. It turns out, much to my surprise, that hummingbirds don't just eat pollen, they also eat some insects. So a hummingbird, which turns out to be an omnivore, is also an insectivore. So another job that it does for the community is to eat insects. It helps reduce insect population. And if you've been outside during a mosquito outbreak, you know that's important to have insectivores around to get rid of insects. So These are two jobs that ruby-throated hummingbirds do for the habitat in which they live. So they're in an ecosystem. Their habitat is the eastern woodland forest, and their niche is, or part of their niche is to be pollinators and insectivores. There are other possibilities you can have for niches. Predators, talked about. Prey, somebody's got to be the food. Predators, prey, and then there were some other relationships between organisms that we called symbiotic, and there were different forms of symbiotic, different ways they could live together. We'll get into more of that later on. So again, we're talking about the same thing we've been talking about all year. We started out with a cell. In order for a cell to be alive, it needed certain things, which included water and food and oxygen. Because that cell needs water, food, and oxygen, the organisms that are made of cells need water, food, and oxygen. And because of that, they need to have ways to get water, food, and oxygen. And now we're looking closely at how they work together, especially multicellular organisms, to accomplish those tasks. So we start with an individual. That individual is part of a population. That population works with other populations in a community. Those communities reside within different geographical regions that include abiotic factors. We're going to call those ecosystems. We can break those ecosystems into a few large groups that we'll call biomes. And all of those biomes are found on this planet, and actually a very narrow range of planet Earth that we call the biosphere. All right, I am going to post some assignments. These assignments should be very familiar to you. They are the vocabulary, pre-reading, reading, videos, and formatives. For section 1 of the chapter 2 that I posted in the classroom. Continue to work with those, and tomorrow I will put up slides for the second section where we're going to talk more closely about the movement of energy within ecosystems.